Whoever assumed these 5 battleships met a dramatic end in the years immediately after the armistice would be wrong. No scuttling at a windswept anchorage, no formal surrender ceremony, no foreign flag run up a mast. The real story of the Revenge class is stranger than that. A quarter of a century of quiet, underfunded service, interrupted by one catastrophic night in 1939, before all 5 vanished not to enemy action, but to the shipbreaker's torch. The Admiralty understood these ships would shape naval thinking for a generation, and yet, by the end, they were treated as the poor relations of the battle fleet, and that neglect is precisely what makes their story worth telling properly. When the guns fell silent on 11th of November 1918, the 5 ships of the class, Royal Sovereign, Royal Oak, Revenge, Resolution, and Ramillies, were fully intact, fully armed, and still very much part of the Grand Fleet. Revenge and Royal Oak had already proven themselves at Jutland on 31st May 1916, standing in the battle line of the 1st Battle Squadron as part of the Grand Fleet's main force. The other 3, completed too late for that engagement, had spent the war's final years on patrol and gunnery work in home waters. Each carried 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, oil-fired boilers, and armor intended to withstand exactly the kind of punishment German dreadnoughts could deliver. There was no question of these ships being surrendered or interned, unlike the high seas fleet gathering at Scapa Flow that same winter. Instead, the immediate post-war question facing the Admiralty was entirely different. What to do with a battle fleet built for a war that had just ended, at a moment when the Treasury wanted economies and naval architects abroad were already sketching the next generation of capital ships? The question was answered, in large part, by Washington rather than by Whitehall. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 capped capital ship tonnage across the major powers and effectively froze new construction for a decade. Britain retained the Revenge class as part of its permitted tonnage, but the treaty's restrictions meant these 5 ships received only modest attention over the following 2 decades, while their half-sisters of the Queen Elizabeth class, as longtime viewers of this channel will know from an earlier episode, underwent extensive reconstruction. The Revenge-class ships got anti-torpedo bulges, updated anti-aircraft batteries, and in some cases, catapults for spotter aircraft, but never the wholesale modernization of boilers, machinery, and deck armor that transformed their sister design. By the mid-1930s, naval planners routinely described them as the weakest capital ships in the fleet, slower than nearly everything else flying the White Ensign at barely 21 knots against newer battleships approaching 30. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the 5 ships rotated between the Atlantic Fleet and the Mediterranean Fleet, showing the flag at Malta, Gibraltar, and occasionally further afield, training gunnery crews and serving as flagships for junior admirals whose careers rarely intersected with anything more dramatic than a fleet review. Royal Sovereign spent long stretches as flagship of the 2nd Battle Squadron. Resolution and Ramillies shuttled between home waters and the Mediterranean Station. It was an unglamorous existence for ships that had cost, in 1916 prices, roughly $2.5 million apiece to build, and it reflected a wider truth about interwar Britain. The Royal Navy simply could not afford to keep every wartime battleship at the cutting edge, and the Revenge class drew the short straw. The Second World War changed that calculus overnight, though not in the way anyone in 1918 might have predicted. On the night of the 14th October 1939, Royal Oak lay at anchor inside Scapa Flow, believed secure behind the anchorage's defenses. Captain Lieutenant Gunther Preen brought U-47 through a gap in the block ships at Kirk Sound and fired torpedoes that struck the old battleship in the early hours of the morning. She capsized and sank within minutes, taking 833 of her crew down with her, including 134 boy sailors. It remains one of the Royal Navy's worst single losses of the entire war, and it exposed just how vulnerable Scapa Flow's defenses had become in the 2 decades since the German fleet had scuttled itself there. The wreck was declared a war grave, and it remains one to this day, resting inverted in around 30 meters of water. The 4 survivors did not simply sit out the war that followed. Resolution took part in Operation Menace, the failed Anglo-Free French attempt to seize Dakar from Vichy French forces in September 1940, and was torpedoed by the Vichy submarine Beauvaisier, suffering serious damage that put her into an American shipyard for repairs before she returned to escort duties and eventually training work. Ramillies survived a torpedo strike from a Japanese midget submarine off Diego Suarez in Madagascar in May 1942, one of the very few Royal Navy capital ships to be attacked by Japanese midget craft during the war, and went on, remarkably, to bombard German coastal defenses off the Normandy beaches during the D-Day landings in June 1944, her old 15-inch guns still capable of shore bombardment even if they were hopelessly outmatched for fleet action against modern battleships. Revenge spent most of the war on convoy escort in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean before being relegated to training duties, her fighting days effectively over well before Germany surrendered. Royal Sovereign's fate was the strangest of all. In 1944, as part of the complicated arrangements over dividing the surrendered Italian fleet between the Allies, pending a final settlement, she was loaned to the Soviet Union and recommissioned into the Soviet Navy as Arkhangelsk, crewed by roughly 900 Soviet sailors and serving in the Arctic and Baltic theaters until the war's end. She remained under the Soviet flag until 1949, when she was returned to Britain in a considerably worn condition, the only Revenge-class ship ever to serve under a foreign ensign, and one of only a handful of British capital ships to be operated by a foreign navy in the 20th century. If you're finding this deep dive into the Revenge-class interesting, do consider subscribing for more on what happened to Britain's older capital ships once the fighting stopped. By 1948, the Admiralty's decision was straightforward and by then largely uncontested. All 4 surviving ships were old, slow, expensive to maintain, and entirely obsolete against the battleships and aircraft carriers of the post-war era. Revenge went to the breakers at Inverkeithing in 1948, having spent her final years as an accommodation and training hulk. Resolution followed the same year, broken up after a long period laid up in reserve. Ramillies, despite her wartime service off Normandy, was scrapped in 1948 as well, her guns and armor reduced to scrap metal at a time when Britain badly needed steel for post-war reconstruction. Royal Sovereign, returned battered from Soviet service, was scrapped in 1949, the last of the class to go. Unlike the German High Seas Fleet, whose scuttled hulks at Scapa Flow became salvage projects lasting decades, the Revenge class simply disappeared from British yards within a matter of months, cut apart by acetylene torch rather than sent to the bottom by naval action. There was little sentiment attached to the process. Post-war Britain had neither the money nor, frankly, much appetite for preserving 5 aging dreadnoughts that most of the public associated more with quiet interwar service than any celebrated victory. Nothing of the Revenge class survives afloat today, and no complete ship from the class exists in any museum collection, a fact that surprises people who assume every significant capital ship of the era found its way into preservation somewhere. What remains is scattered and modest. The ship's bell of Royal Oak is held by the Church of St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall, close to Scapa Flow, and the wreck itself, still leaking small amounts of oil more than 8 decades on, is treated with the same protected status as any Commonwealth war grave, with diving restricted to official commemorative visits. Fittings, badges, and smaller artifacts from the other 4 ships are held individually by regimental and naval museums, including the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth, but there is no equivalent to the preserved dreadnoughts one finds elsewhere. No Revenge-class ship to walk the decks of the way visitors can aboard HMS Belfast on the Thames. The class's real legacy lies less in physical survival than in the lessons the Royal Navy drew from its underinvestment. The Revenge class became something of a cautionary tale in post-war naval planning, a reminder of what happens when treaty limits and financial austerity are allowed to freeze a warship design in place for 2 decades, while rival navies modernize. Their WW1 service, however unglamorous compared to the newer King George V-class battleships, demonstrated that even obsolete capital ships retained value for shore bombardment and convoy escort long after they had ceased to be credible in fleet actions. Royal Oak's loss, meanwhile, directly reshaped Scapa Flow's wartime defenses and remains studied today as a case study in anchorage security. What can be seen of the class now amounts to little more than a bell, a war grave, and scattered fittings in museum stores, a strikingly thin physical legacy for ships that once represented the cutting edge of British naval power. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to Britain's Queen Elizabeth-class battleships after World War I next. It explores how their sister design received the modernization the Revenge class never did, and why that difference shaped their very different fates. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.